So welcome everyone. So happy to be together again. This class is the Postmodern Piety of Rav Shagar with Rabbi Zachary Truboff. As you're coming in, you'll get an invitation to become a panelist. If you accept the invitation, it will allow us to see your smiling face if you wish to turn on your video, but more importantly, it would also allow you to unmute yourself to ask questions or make comments. If you prefer, you can also participate through the chat box here in Zoom or as a comment on Facebook. If you're watching us live, welcome as well. Please stay muted when you're not actively speaking and just feel free to unmute when you do like to. And with that, I'll turn this to you, Rabbi Truboff.
Thank you so much, Evie. Good evening to everyone from Yerushalayim. We are continuing. This is our second to last class together on the postmodern piety of Rav Shagar. Up until now, we've been focusing on very, I would say, heady themes, questions about what does it mean for a Jew in today's world to have a relationship to God, to have a relationship to Torah, questions of emunah, bitachon, questions of suffering, sadik v'ralo. What I want to do with today's session, and in some ways it's not going to do Rav Shagar justice, because what I want to do today is look at questions of ethics and through Rav Shagar's unique lens. And the reason I say it's not necessarily going to do Rav Shagar justice is that I would say a very significant portion of his writings deal with the question of ethics, deal with the question of what is our ethical responsibility to the other. And they also are really resound with this profound sensibility of the extent to which the world we live in is not the ideal world that we yearn for. Right? Rav Shagar's writings are suffused, I would say, with a prophetic sensibility in the sense that just as the prophets were deeply aware to injustice, to oppression, to the fact our world is so broken, and they were able to write about it in such powerful and compelling terms, so too Rav Shagar very much has that sensibility. It's not necessarily the case for every rabbi or every Jewish thinker. Sometimes rabbis like to talk about ethics, but they don't always like to talk about how broken the world truly is. And one of the things that I really appreciate about Rav Shagar is that he gets that. He gets that the world is a really, really, really complicated place. In many ways, Rav Shagar follows in the footsteps of Jewish thinkers like Martin Buber, Franz Rosenzweig, Emanuel Levinas, and that his writings do really emphasize this sense of obligation that we have to the other, right? Traditional liberal Jewish ethics often focus on the individual. They often focus on the individual and how the individual is supposed to better themselves, right? Sort of a classic modern take on Jewish ethics tends to focus on the idea of empathy, right? We were slaves in Egypt. We know what suffering is like. We have to have empathy for the suffering of others. It's always very much focused on the individual, right? It's our job to be the best person we can be, right? To be the most moral and ethical person that we can be. And that's what matters most. So the problem with that kind of ethical thinking, there's a couple of problems, but I'll mention two that are very much, I think, what Rav Shagar is aware of in his own thinking. And that is, number one, we often don't know what the other wants or needs, right? So the idea that we can predetermine ethics is always a very complicated idea. Not so much because we can't on some level try to know what is good or bad in some abstract sense, but when we get to the concrete reality of the person in front of us, we often have to discover fairly quickly that we might have our own notions of what we think good and bad is. We might even have our own notions of what we think is good and bad for the person in front of us. But at the same time, it's not necessarily up to us to decide those things, right? We're not mind readers. We can't impose our needs onto others. And therefore, part of the great challenge of ethics is we don't know what's right for others. And Rav Shagar, again, following in Levinas and Rosenzweig, a lot of his ethical thinking is forcing us to confront the fact that ethics is never truly obvious or universal, right? We don't really know what the other needs, and it's not up for us to tell them. And yet we are still bound to them. We are still compelled by them in their need, in that human relationship. in ways that are often very difficult to us, because we want relationships to make sense. We want to be able to define the rules of relationships ahead of time. But as we know, in our most intimate and most important relationships, it just doesn't really work that way, right? If you want to try to define your relationship with a loved one, a parent, a spouse, a child, through strict ethical rules, you will find out very quickly that that kind of approach, it just destroys the relationship, right? Because ethics on a certain level has to transcend any kind of strict or narrow rules that we want to impose on human relationships. That's number one. Number two, the other way in which Rav Shagar, I would say, plots a path that's a little different from what we often think about is, again, modern individualist Jewish ethics, open your heart, be a good person, love the neighbor, and that is that love the stranger. The way Rav Shagar differs is that he also recognizes that ethics isn't all about the individual. That when it comes to ethics, we have to look at the structures and societies that people live in and participate in. And this, I think, is a really interesting point, and we're going to see how he plays this out today. That maybe like the great fault or the great ethical failings that we have to confront are not the failings of individuals, but rather the failings of systems of which individuals are all each just a small part of. And that kind of systemic critique, I think, is going to be very important, because when you only focus on the individual and you want to just run around, telling everybody, how you need to be better as an individual, don't be so wicked, be more open, be more thoughtful, love the stranger. What that always fundamentally obscures or even ignores is the broader context that we all live in, right? You can try to be the most righteous person you want, but if you live in stone, we all know what's going to happen. Right. And what Rav Shagar, I think, is sensitive to is the recognition that maybe we live in stone and don't even realize it. And if that's the case, then maybe that should be getting our attention, and not just only, the effort to work on ourselves or better ourselves, or try to point out to others their own, or other individuals at least, their own failings. So I know this all sounds abstract, but we're going to see how Rav Shagar concretizes this through a story of Rabbi Nachman of Breslov. In addition to Rav Shagar, Rabbi Nachman has been accompanying us through each one of these lessons, each one of these classes, because Rabbi Nachman is such an important thinker for Rav Shagar to look at the world differently, to look at religious life differently, because Rabbi Nachman himself is a radical thinker. Rabbi Nachman challenges the Chassidut of his day, but Rabbi Nachman isn't just challenging for the Chassidut of his day, right? Anybody who opens up anything that Rabbi Nachman has written, even right now, is going to find it shocking and challenging and radical. And as I mentioned last time, sometimes Rabbi Nachman saves his most radical teachings for stories, because, as I think I mentioned before, there are things that we cannot hear if people try to tell us directly, but in the context of a story, we can perhaps be open to them. Right, you've probably had this experience when you've gone to the movies before, right? You go to the movie and you have to confront something that might be very challenging for you. And on a certain level, the experience of seeing the movie can open you up to things that if someone had showed up at your house and wanted to give you the lecture of what that movie was about, the moral lecture, the didactic lecture, you wouldn't have been able to hear it at all. Right, but there's something about the context of a story that enables us to both identify with what is going on, but also experience it a little bit at a distance. And in doing so, open us up to truths that we maybe aren't so open to otherwise. I think the example I gave last time is when David sins by basically having relations with a married woman and then sending off her husband to war to die so that David can have her all by himself. When the prophet has to come to rebuke David, he doesn't just go to David and say, you're a murderer, you're an adulterer, you've sinned, right? The prophet knows that if he does that, David's going to reject it. So instead, the prophet offers David a parable, right? A parable about a rich man and a poor man, and a rich man who decides to take the poor man's lamb just because he can, basically, because he doesn't want to have to use his own resources. So why not take from the weak and vulnerable? And in the context of the parable, the story, David can hear it. And that is often the challenge for us, that the most radical things, the most important things we need to hear, that we will do everything in our can to run away from if anybody's ever going to confront us with them directly, that perhaps the only way we can really begin to even grapple with them is in the context of a story. So the story that I want to look at by Rabbi Nachman, that Rav Shagar writes about in a few places. I never encountered this story before I learned Rav Shagar. In many ways, much of Rabbi Nachman I did not really know or have any familiarity with, except through Rav Shagar, at least early on. And one of the themes in Rabbi Nachman's writings that make him a little unique in his own time is that Rabbi Nachman lives at the beginning of the 19th century, and he lives basically when modernity is starting to come into its own, but specifically, he is living at a time when capitalism is beginning to remake the world. Capitalism is beginning to remake what we think of as the modern world on a variety of levels. And there's massive amounts of social change that are going to take place over the 19th century due to the radical transformations that capitalism will help bring about. And already in Rabbi Nachman's time, he is recognizing that the world is changing and not necessarily for the better, right? As the world becomes modern, as the world revolves around the dollar, Rabbi Nachman recognizes that religion loses something. It loses something very, very important in that process. And in one of his stories called The Master of Prayer, he describes a tzaddik known as the Master of Prayer, who basically has to live outside major society, right? He basically has to live on his own. He's like a small band of followers. He's a Rebbe who has like a small group of Talmidim, of students. And the Master of Prayer tries to go around and get people to see the light, right? To recognize sort of all the problems of their, for lack of a better expression, modern world. And in the context of the story, Rabbi Nachman describes a place he calls the land of wealth. Mizinat HaMamon in Hebrew, the land of wealth. And in Rabbi Nachman's description of the land of wealth, he offers what is a profound critique for much of what we experience in the modern world today, as it relates to the problem of money. It's fascinating. You'll see here that he writes this over 200 years ago. It feels like, as we're going to go through, as we can see, like he is speaking to our very own reality. And the major problem of the land of wealth is the way that it creates an environment that is so fundamentally antithetical to having a relationship with God, and for our purposes, having a relationship with your fellow human being, having any kind of ethical relationship at all. So here's how Rabbi Nachman describes the land of wealth. He says as follows. He says, meanwhile, there was a land that had great wealth. Everyone there was wealthy. The land, however, had a very strange and unusual customs, since everything was dependent on wealth. So what's interesting to note right from the beginning is that the reason this place is called the land of wealth is that everybody there is wealthy, right? You might think right off the bat that would make this a really good place, because we tend to assume that much of the problems around money, right, much of capitalism's faults are a reflection of scarcity, right? We don't have enough, right? That's why we have to set up the market to best distribute resources in an effective manner, right? And if you had more, right, there would be less inequality, right? That's sort of the general assumption of economic thinking. But we're going to see here is this is a land that has enough, right? Has more than enough. And even though they have more than enough, right, they have a society that is profoundly unequal. And because of that inequality, it is a place of great oppression. He says, and here's what's unique about the land of wealth, is he says a person's status and worth were determined solely on the basis of his wealth, right? The whole social order, the whole social hierarchy is determined by how much money you have. Where you fall within the social order is a reflection of how many zeros you have in your bank account. He says one who had thousands or tens of thousands in cash had a certain social rank. The entire order of social rank was thus determined by the amount that each one had according to their constitution in the land of wealth, right? The one with the most money was king, right? How much money you have determines your social rank,
And the one with the most money is at the top, right? They are the king. They are the one with the greatest power, right? That's the way the land is structured. Its whole social structure is dependent on money, and where you fall is going to determine where you are in the hierarchy. Right away, again, we kind of know this, right? In modern society, your social rank, your social world is eminently determined by how much money you have, right? I think we know this is a social fact that we all like to pretend isn't true, but we all tend to only socialize with our closest friends, tend to almost always be of the same socioeconomic status as us. It's very rare that we have friends that are much richer than us or much poorer than us, right? That's just the way stratification works in capitalism, right? There's social stratification. People live around people and are close with people of a similar socioeconomic background. So we might say, well, wait a second, our world isn't determined by money. But when you start looking around, you start to realize that where you are, who you're with in the social hierarchy is almost inevitably determined, again, by how many zeros you have in the bank account. One of the strangest experiences for me when I was a synagogue rabbi, what made that, and I only realized this maybe afterwards, what made that experience being a shul rabbi so different than most other people is as a shul rabbi, you have social relationships with people at the top and people at the bottom. And you come to realize over time that almost nobody else has those kinds of range of relationships. It just doesn't really happen for most people because, again, we fall into a certain social rank on the hierarchy. Even now, when I'm not a shul rabbi, my world is not as broad as it used to be, right? I tend to look at the people we are closest with, the people who come to our house for Shabbat dinner. We go there, they're closer to us in social rank. Again, social economic background, because that's the way the world works. So Rabbi Nachman's going to go on here to describe how is it that we sort of designate the different social ranks in the social hierarchy according to money. He says the people had banners. Every person in the land of wealth has a banner, right? And there was one banner that denoted a certain amount of money and a certain rank associated with that banner. Meaning, depending on how much money you have, that will determine the image or the sign that goes on your banner. And everybody will see that banner and sign and know exactly where you fall within the social hierarchy. He says, rank was determined in the following manner. If a person had a certain amount of money, he was considered an ordinary human being. There's different insignias that appear on the banner. So if you have enough, you're a human being. That's the image that'll be on there. But if you don't have enough, if you're below a certain threshold, then that person would be considered a bird or a beast, right? You would actually be an animal. At a certain point, if you don't have enough money, you are no longer treated like a human being. People don't treat you like a human being. He says here, thus the poorest among them were considered no better than birds or beasts, since money was the most important thing, right? Money determines your rank, and if you don't have enough, you're not even human. Now, again, this sounds harsh, but I don't think we have to stretch our brains very hard to recognize that in our society, that many people, when they fall below a certain socioeconomic threshold, they are no longer looked at as human beings. Or this is particularly true with people who are homeless, or people who are homeless and, again, have all sorts of social problems, drug addictions, mental health issues, right? At a certain point, you see these people, and in truth, you don't really see them, right? It's like walking on the street and seeing, a stray dog, stray cat, right? We don't look at them as human beings any longer. Certainly not societally, right? Like if you're not wealthy enough to have health insurance and something happens to you, right? As we all know, like society is basically going to look the other way, right? If you don't have enough money, you don't have enough status, and you're not going to be treated as a human being. It's one of the great failures of modern society, right? Is that we can't guarantee human rights for everyone. And we all kind of know, right? Those who have more money have more rights. And that in some ways is a profound indictment of the world that we live in, because for the most part, we do live in a world in which there's a lot of wealth, a lot of money. There's not a scarcity, right? Like if anything, there's an excess at times. He goes on here. He says, the people agreed that they wanted to establish the rank of stars and constellations, right? It wasn't enough that your insignia as you get more money would get you a higher status as a human being. You could actually, with enough money, achieve the status of the stars, or to be considered an angel. Or if you get enough money, he says, you would actually get conferred upon you the rank of gods. So there's a way in which if you have enough, you actually stop being a human being the other way, right? Like you actually transcend being human. You are beyond human. You are a god. And Rabbi Nachman says, once this has been established, they agreed that it was not fitting for these ultra rich people who are now going to be treated as gods to remain in the atmosphere of this world, right? The rich people, like, they shouldn't be around like with the rest of everyone, right? It says, moreover, it was not considered fitting for them to mix with other people of the world, since this would defile them, right? The regular world of human beings is beneath the rich people, right? It will defile them, it'll purify them. Therefore, they have to go to their own special place, high above. So what did they do? They therefore decided they would search for the highest mountains in the world and live there, right? So the rich people who are gods are going to live away from everybody else, like Shocker, right? And they're going to live high above, right? That's often the case, right? Like, what's the most expensive apartment in a building? Right? People here live in Manhattan, right? What's the most expensive apartment? It's not necessarily the one all the way on the bottom, right? It's typically the one all the way on the top, right? And we can ask ourselves why exactly that might be the case. But the rich people want to be away from everybody else. They're gods. They don't want to have to mingle. And so they look for the highest mountain. And not only do they want to be on the highest mountain, Rabbi Nachman says, but guards were stationed far from the mountains so that no strangers would be allowed to approach them, right? The rich people put guards on the bottom so that anybody who tried to approach them would basically be stopped, right? They live in not even just gated communities, but there's physical force used to keep the riffraff away, even if they wanted to come and engage the rich people, the gods. This, however, brought about great concern about murder and robbery. People would be very ready to kill and steal in the land of wealth, since they could become gods with the stolen money. And this is in many ways part of the most important ethical point that Rabbi Nachman is going to make here. What kind of place is it, this land of wealth, if all the social ranks are determined by how much money you have? And if you fall too low, you're not human. But if you have enough, you might be treated as a god, right? What that's going to create is this profound motivation for competition, right? Everybody is going to be out to outdo the other, right? To get money out of the other. And not only they're going to try to do it legally, there's a profound incentive to get as much money as you can illegally, right? Because if you steal enough or you kill to get it, right, you might actually be able to become a god, right? And again, we don't have to look very far in the modern headlines to recognize that people will do anything to make millions and billions of dollars, not just because they're greedy per se. I mean, they are, but because they know that if they get that much money, they will be treated as gods. There's profound incentive here, but that incentive also creates profound alienation, right? People don't know how to have a real relationship with each other, because every time they're engaging with each other, what's the one thing they're thinking about, right? What's the one thing, right? How do I get more money? How do I get some value out of this interaction? Right? That is the way the land of wealth works, right? Everything's about money. Everything's about trying to get more money. Every interaction, everything you do is oriented towards that goal. And so it's a place of competition, ultimately violence. And the threat of violence is always hovering, right? People are always worried, is crime going up, right? Like, oh, what are we going to do now, right? Oh, people are out there. They might try to get something we have, right? In that kind of land, right? You have violence, and you have violence being imposed in multiple directions. You got rich people trying to keep the poor people away, poor people trying to get whatever they can, right? Like it's a profoundly corrupt situation. Rabbi Nachman goes on to describe, he says, in the land of wealth, they set up a system of services and sacrifices to their gods, right? These human beings that are rich enough to be considered gods, you actually could offer sacrifices to them. They would also offer even human sacrifices. Many people would also voluntarily offer themselves as sacrifices to their gods, believing that they would become incorporated into them and later be incarnated as a wealthy man. Right? So in the world of wealth, you offer sacrifices to the celebrities. Oh, whoops. I mean, to the rich people, right? Like this is something we all know, right? People who are considered to be rich and powerful, who are treated as gods, they are the source of our adulation. And we will express that adulation in all sorts of ways. We'll make sure to like their posts on Facebook. We'll buy the commodities they produce. We'll look at their image and have their posters up in our homes, right? And we'll give everything we can to them, every dollar that we can potentially, because we want to be like them. Like we hope to be gods too. We hope to be famous, right? If you look at, again, social media today, right, it is full of people who are perceived to be gods, the celebrities. and the other half, which are people who are trying to become celebrities, gods themselves, and will do anything they can, even sacrifice themselves to be able to, to achieve that. Right? Not a particularly, wonderful environment. And if we're thinking about things religiously, we now have a world in which you worship human beings, these human beings that are rich enough to be treated as gods, and you're willing to sacrifice human lives as part of that worship, either because you want to become like them or because you believe they demand it or deserve it. And again, Rabbi Nachman reiterates, their main thing in life was money, right? That's all that matters in the land of wealth. With money, one could buy anything. And in a sense, Rabbi Nachman's kind of noting, maybe they're not wrong. If money gives you ultimate power, if money lets you buy whatever you want and do whatever you want, then maybe the main thing in life should be money, right? Like maybe that's all that really is worth anything at the end of the day. Rabbi Nachman continues, he says, according to their belief system, human existence was based on money. Wealth was therefore the focus of their belief. According to their religion, charity was a very great sin. And this is the final point, and a very important one. In the land of wealth, what is forbidden? Charity is forbidden. Right? You can't give your money to somebody else who is in need, right? They believe that if a person gave charity, it would diminish the influx of wealth that God had given them, right? You can't give your money to somebody else because that's like spitting in God's face, right? God gave you the money. God wants you to have the money, right? For you to give it to anybody else is a disgrace to God. It's a chila Hashem, right? To give to a poor person. God wants you to have it, not them. They didn't work for it. They didn't earn it. You did. It's yours. Right? The main goal was to have as much wealth as possible. It was therefore forbidden in the strongest terms to give charity. I'll just note here, I mentioned before about Stom, right? In the rabbinic midrashim about Stom, right? One of the classic understandings, it's not in the Pshat of the Torah, but in the midrashim, that part of what made Stom so evil is they outlawed the giving of tzedakah, right? And in this case, Rabbi Nachman is playing on that. And he's noting that the reason tzedakah is basically forbidden, it's usher, because it is antithetical to what the land of wealth is about. The land of wealth is to get as much money as you can, then to give any of it away is like the greatest sin, right? Like, because the greatest mitzvah is get all you can. So to give it away for any reason, like again, is a chila Hashem in the land of wealth, which is obviously a horrible thing to say, but that's the way that they the way that they conceive of things. Again, I'll just note here, I'm going to be a little bit cynical, right? It's easy to see how this plays out through like modern society, but like, again, Jewish communities also often function pretty similarly to this as well, right? If part of what makes synagogues unique is that everybody has to come together, right? Like, again, the rich and the poor, for the most part, they come together at the same synagogue. That's not always true, right? There are synagogues in Manhattan, which everybody probably has above a certain number in their bank accounts. But outside of unique places, and I said that my in-laws live in Manhattan, so I love Manhattan. I don't have anything against it, but I'm just noting that there's a little bit of economic, stratification there. That synagogues are somewhat diverse, and that does make them unique. But again, like if you go to a synagogue, right, you don't have to look hard to realize there's like a social ranking, like an informal social ranking that takes place, right? Because depending on how much money you have, depending, how much of a macher you are, right, you'll be the person of importance, right? The president of a synagogue is never the person with the least amount of money in shul. I don't think I've ever heard of a synagogue in Jewish history where the president had the least amount of money. Like that just doesn't happen, obviously, right? And as we know, like if you're wealthy enough, you get your name on things. If you're wealthy enough, you get to call the shots. And everybody knows pretty much what the pecking order is, right? That's the fascinating thing in a shul. It's very, very rare for ultra wealthy people, even just wealthy people, to be there, and for everybody to like not know who they are, and vice versa. Like everybody kind of knows like where they fall, like again on the social ranking. We don't have to wear banners, but we wear certain clothing that telegraphs things. We drive certain cars, right? Again, in modern day life, the car that you drive may be the most significant example of the banner, because again, whether you drive a Mercedes-Benz or like a Toyota or like a Hyundai, right? Like one doesn't really get you there that much faster than the other. But if you are spending tens and tens and tens of thousands of dollars on more expensive cars, on a certain level, it is to signal or telegraph something of importance about what that car means, right? The car, an expensive luxury car, is always a bit of a banner in the way that Rabbi Nachman, describes it here. So we're familiar with this. We're familiar with this even in Jewish life. And I'll just give you a citation from Rabbi Nachman's teachings. This is from Likutei Maharan, where these are his theological essays. He's very direct in this case. Again, you'll just see how basically the story is a more sophisticated distillation of what he says here. He says here, as it is written in Exodus, in the Ten Commandments, you shall have no other gods before me. Right now, these people, Rabbi Nachman says, who succumb to the desire for money and do not believe that the Holy One can provide man with a livelihood through an easy way, extend great effort in chasing after their sustenance. He's saying people who don't really have faith, they spend all their life trying to get money, right? They spend all their life trying to get money. And in a certain sense, what he's saying here, and we can debate if this is true, certainly, but like the people who spend the most energy trying to make money are the people who on some level reflect the least amount of faith. Because faith on a certain level means not just faith that God will provide, but faith helps to open you up to the possibility that maybe money is the most important thing in the world. He says here, they eat their bread with sorrow. Those are the people who spend all their life pursuing money with great sorrow, as it says in Parshas Noach, you will eat, or Bereshit, sorrow being melancholy. People who pursue money their whole lives, they don't live, for the most part, the happiest lives. Such people are tied to the countenance of the other side, of the Sitra Achra, the other gods, meaning he's connecting it here to the notion of idolatry. Darkness, the aspect of death, this is written in Eicha. He set me in darkness as those long dead. Of them, said Yechezkel, and their gold is something impure. Right? Rabbi Nachman plays up with this in a few places, right? That the pesel, the idol of gold and silver, is, on some level can be seen as an allusion to money. And as he says here, this corresponds to idolatry. So even in his more straightforward theological writings, he notes that, again, he doesn't think money is evil inherently. What Rabbi Nachman is most concerned about is that when you pursue money as the highest good, right, as that which is most important, and as that which you ultimately need more than anything else. Now, most of us will say, on the one hand, like, I'm not like looking to make as much money as I can. Like, that's not like where I put all my energies into. But the moment that we assume that money is a necessity for survival, for power, that we can't live without it, right? Rabbi Nachman would argue that on a certain level, you have traded the, God for the dollar, right? And this is going to be a point that Rav Shagar is going to make. I'll switch to it right now. Rav Shagar, again, uses this story in multiple places. And again, he knows that it's this great, depiction of social criticism, because again, what Rabbi Nachman depicts 2,200 years ago is just like, we know this. We know exactly what the land of wealth looks like as we live it. So here's what Rav Shagar is saying about Rabbi Nachman's deeper point. He says, the modern individual does not find their refuge in God, but rather in their money and possessions, a reality that is fitting for the land of wealth described by Rabbi Nachman, right? In the modern world, we put our faith in the dollar, right? We believe that is what is going to protect us. That's why we have such a hard time parting with it, right? Like, we all have many of us have more money than we need, but we are always hesitant to give it up because we'll say to ourselves, like, I might need it. Like, I've got this much money, but what if something happens in a couple of years from now? I may not have enough, right? That anxiety is something that dominates all of us, even if we don't think about it. Because if it didn't dominate us, we'd be a lot more comfortable with giving up a lot more of our money, but we never are for the most part. Rav Shagar says money grants a person security and something firm to hold on to. It constitutes a replacement for grasping hold of God. And part of what we understand with modernity and with capitalism, and this is a point that Marx makes very, very clearly, is that modernity is about the disenchantment of the world, right? It's about no longer seeing the divine within the world, right? God recedes, and we look at the world in a different way, right? That's just the nature of what modernity means. Even for those who believe in God, we don't believe that God involves himself in the world like our ancestors did. Nobody does that. Nobody alive does that today for the most part, right? And what happens in a world in which we don't see God in it or in every inch of it, right? We see the world in a secular fashion, even very religious people. What that means is that faith doesn't necessarily mean for us what it did for our ancestors, because we live in a world that is essentially secular. And what that means is we live in a world in which it often feels as if what happens is somewhat arbitrary and it works according to rules far beyond our control. And what Marx points out in some of his early essays is that money in a disenchanted world is what takes on, again, as Rabbi Nachman himself said, it's the ultimate source of power, right? Money is what grants power to do just about anything, right? And in a world that's empty of God, or that feels empty of God, right, we need to hold on to as much power as we got, right? And that's why we treat money as a holy object, essentially, because it is the power that we want God to be, right? If you had to choose tomorrow between $1 billion and having faith, and you're going to say which one is going to protect you over the next century, right? And all the trials and tribulations humanity is going to face, I think most of us would say, maybe I'll have that $1 billion, right? Like, the money is power. We know this, right? Money enables you to do just about anything. And that's what we want faith to be. But faith isn't that, as we've seen before in earlier sessions. So that reality means that we have an attachment to money that can only be called religious in a certain sense. Now, the other point that Rav Shagar really highlights, again, using this story, is the way, so again, the world that we live in, instead of faith in God, it's faith in the dollar. And again, this is something that's almost unconscious, right? We hold on to it as a way of alleviating our anxiety in ways that we don't realize it. That's why, if you want to know, understand our own attachment to money, then you have to be willing to confront the anxiety that you would feel in losing a bunch of it. And if that freaks you out, the idea of losing a significant amount of money, then that is a reflection of just how emotionally, how psychologically you are fundamentally attached to it and the role that it plays for you. The second point that Rav Shagar is going to get at here, again, is this notion of alienation, right? That capitalism creates a profound estrangement between people because everything's about competition, because everything's ultimately about exchange, right? The whole chiddush of the free market is that you come together, two people or two parties, and you are able to make what we would consider to be a fair exchange. I give you this, you give me that. I work for you doing this, you pay me this amount of money, right? The whole idea is that there's an exchange that goes on. But what that means is the kind of relationships that we have with other people are always transactional. And if they're always transactional, what that means is we're always looking at them about what we can get out of them, right? That is Marx famously, when he describes commodity fetishism, if people are familiar with this in the first volume of Capital, right? What Marx is getting at is what he calls the commodity form, that we look at people and things and situations all through the lens of value. How much am I putting in? How much am I getting out? How much is this worth? Is it worth my time and my effort and my energy? Right? That kind of thinking, which comes so naturally to us, is something that perhaps shouldn't be so natural, that maybe it actually comes with real problems. So Rav Shagar says here, he says, the foundation of stubborn capitalism is the rule of cruel competition that has no boundaries. Man is wolf to man, right? Which is a Latin saying that Freud says it. I can't remember who says it before Freud. Maybe Hobbes says it. I can't remember. It's a line that Rav Shagar uses more than once, right? That we live in a world in which there's so much competition that, again, it feels like the other is just out to get you and you got to get them first, right? Like, and again, we know that the business world certainly often operates like this, right? Life is pretty cutthroat, right? You got to get the best when you can, because otherwise the other person's going to get the best of you first. And that kind of cruel competition extends everywhere, right? In the modern world, right, part of the critique is that we are competitive with each other in ways that are irrational, right? We think the other is a threat, even though they're not, because we're always looking at, again, relationships through this lens of what do I get out of it? And if I don't get what I want, they're going to get what they want, and I'm going to lose. Everything becomes a win-lose scenario, right? That's the challenge with transactional interactions. He says here, it becomes I versus I, ego versus ego, right? It's about self and other and who's going to win. Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch explains the word cruel. The word cruel in Hebrew is achzar. And Hirsch explains that as completely estranged. The one who is cruel relates to the other with complete estrangement, meaning the two words, if you break down achzar into two separate words, it's ach and zar. Zar means foreign, and ach in this case means like surely foreign. The other is completely foreign, completely estranged to me. And when we look at another and we see them as completely foreign to us, we see them as somebody, again, who we're in competition with. Are we going to beat them or they're going to beat us? And when we look at the person as someone who is foreign and strange, if we look at them as like a predator, essentially, then again, we don't feel any ethical responsibility to them whatsoever. We relate to the other with complete estrangement without any feelings of love. He is estranged from him. Estrangement and alienation are the source of cruelty, and this estrangement is the foundational principle of capitalism. So again, you have to ask yourselves, like, why is Rav Shagar? Is he such a Marxist? He's a communist? So one of the things that we have to understand is that within the history of Zionism, right, religious Zionism, of which Rav Shagar is a major proponent of, right? Religious Zionism in Israel has a major history of being deeply committed to socialism, right? The pre-state group of religious Zionism, known as Hapoel HaMizrachi, which was basically the religious Zionist Workers' Party, they were deeply, deeply committed to a socialist ethos, even as religious Jews. And they saw their socialist ethos as reflecting their religious commitments, right? We all know this from the kibbutzim, but the religious kibbutzim founded particularly up in the north and around, where again, we're supposed to be a manifestation of these religious values. And in the first couple decades of the state, the religious Zionist parties were deeply committed to what we might think of as like a more socialist ethos, social justice, for lack of a better expression. So Rav Shagar is coming to this critique from a deeply religious place, coming from this tradition within religious Zionism that saw these issues of justice, issues of equality, and concerns for inequality as being of central importance, right? Unlike in the political discourse in America, where these concerns sometimes label you as being automatically on one political side or the other, in Israel, these concerns were considered a legitimate concern for the left and for the right, right? That's sort of the great irony, or some of the different political differences between America and Israel that a lot of Jews have a hard time grasping. But this is not a progressive issue, the way I'm describing it here in Israel. It is, like, again, what it was part of the Zionist ethos in the mainstream for many, many, many decades. So we have this competition, this alienation, this estrangement that leads to a sense that I'm not responsible for the other. I am not my brother's keeper, right? That is the end point of the land of wealth, right? I am not my brother's keeper, right? They're beneath me. If I give my money, it's actually like betraying my religious obligations. And if they die, it's not my problem, right? That's the kind of world in which an ethical relationship just simply isn't possible. Now, it's interesting, I'll note, Rav Shagar doesn't say this, but it's something that I thought a lot about from my time as a rabbi, and that is that even in places that we might consider to be the land of wealth, people do give tzedakah, at least Jews, right? You can go to the fanciest shul in New York, in Manhattan, and you'll find a lot of people who give a lot of tzedakah. So this, on a certain level, seems to be a contradiction to the Rabbi Nachman's critique, Rav Shagar's critique, right? Wait a second, right? If you're telling me that rich people only care about getting richer, or that anybody, all of us, are only caring about getting more money, what about the fact that we all give tzedakah? We don't live in a world like Stone, in which I don't know of a single shul that's ever banned tzedakah, right? That sounds insane to me, right? It would just no longer be a Jewish place at that point. So here's the thing you have to understand. There's a statement here, I'll mention it, by the rabbis in Bava Basra. People may have heard this before. It says, one who says, I am contributing this coin to tzedakah so that my sons will live, or if he says, I am performing the mitzvah so that I will merit a share in the world to come, this person is a full-fledged righteous person. And what the rabbis are saying here is, if you give tzedakah for ulterior motives, it still counts as a mitzvah, right? If you give tzedakah for ulterior motives, it still counts as a mitzvah. And one of the things that you come to realize if you're involved in Jewish communal work or rabbinic work or synagogue work is that people give a lot of money, but they also tend to give it for ulterior motives, right? This is one of the things that I saw, never failed as a rabbi to see this, is that even the biggest givers and even the smallest givers are usually given because they're getting something out of it, right? It is an act of tzedakah that is often directly influenced by self-interest, right? Again, particularly Ashkenazi shuls are famous for this, but everybody assumes that if you give a check, what's supposed to happen? Not only do you get a thank you, but your name better go up somewhere. It's going to go on a wall, on a board, on a seat, on a Torah, or at least in the weekly newsletter, right? It's got to go somewhere, right? We have it's hard for us as Jews to imagine, again, giving without getting something. And this is part of the reason this was such an insight for me, is that I started to realize this even with myself. One of the good things that happened to me as a rabbi is I started to give more tzedakah. Because when you're in that position, when you have those network of relationships, when you understand what the needs are on a broader scale, you realize just how important tzedakah is, right? Tzedakah, Rabbi Nachman even says, tzedakah makes the world go round in a sense. But what I also realized as I started giving more and more tzedakah, that a large part of the reason I was able to give more and more tzedakah was because I was able to see how I could get out of my tzedakah, meaning I could give in a way that also gave back to me, right? Either because I was able to give to the things that really mattered to me, and I understood those things intimately, or I was able to give in such a way which I knew I can get my name up in the place that I wanted to get it up, or I could give in such a way that showed off to others, like, oh, look, he's giving, and he's giving at this level, like, wow. And I started to realize, yeah, like you give more when you get more out of it. And look, again, that's true at the highest level. People don't give millions unless they get to put their name on something, right? That should tell us all right away, right? Like people give because on some level they're getting. Now, my point here is that the Jewish tradition doesn't seem to have a huge problem with that, right? Again, this text in Bava Basra seems to imply you could give even if it's for ulterior motives. But I would argue that on a certain level, the land of wealth is comfortable with this kind of tzedakah. The land of wealth is comfortable with the kind of tzedakah that is really just a form of exchange. You're giving because you're getting, right? Land of wealth understands that logic. What Rabbi Nachman is aware is that there's another kind of tzedakah that fundamentally works against the logic of the land of wealth. Meaning, in the land of wealth, if you're going to give $1 million to a shul, but you're going to get your name on the building, like, I think they could understand that. It'd be like, okay, it's a little odd, but we get it. Like, it fits within the logic of how this place works. But there's a different kind of tzedakah that fundamentally is just looked at in the land of wealth as an insane act, as something that makes no sense, and as this is the kind of thing that has to be outlawed. And here's what Rav Shagar describes it. And again, he's basing himself here on Rabbi Nachman. We'll see in a moment this larger teaching of Rabbi Nachman. He says tzedakah is an act of self-overcoming, right? Rav Shagar is saying, to really give tzedakah, it actually is like a transformational moment. You have to like overcome yourself. You have to like step out of yourself, step beyond yourself in order to give tzedakah. What does he mean by this? He says, and in actuality, an overcoming of one's individuality. As Rabbi Nachman says in this Torah, the Torah we're going to look at in a moment, this is the essence of the avoda of tzedakah. For one who is compassionate by nature and gives tzedakah because he feels compassionate is not an avoda. What Rabbi Nachman is going to get at is there's different kinds of tzedakah. There's tzedakah that you do because you get something out of it, or because you're a good person. It makes you feel good, right? And that's why you do it. But that kind of tzedakah, the tzedakah that's a form of exchange that works great even in the land of wealth, that kind of tzedakah is not an avoda, right? An avoda is work. An avoda is something that is hard to do, right? Pesach is coming, right? An avoda is what the Jewish people had to do in Egypt, right? It's hard, it's backbreaking. You don't want to do it. Giving tzedakah because you get something out of it is not avoda, right? He says there are, this is him citing Rabbi Nachman, there are wild animals that are compassionate by their nature. Again, like to be a good person and to feel that a good person gives tzedakah and that's what you're going to do too, that in itself is also in a sense a form of exchange. It's not going against the way the order of the world works. Rather, the essence of the avoda, the real tzedakah, is to shatter the cruelty and turn it into compassion. The avoda of tzedakah, this is the tzedakah that I would argue, and Rav Shagar does as well, that goes against the land of wealth, that kind of breaks the land of wealth, and that's why it's not allowed there, is a tzedakah that you do that begins in a place of cruelty, right? The tzedakah that you do, where in the beginning of it, you don't want to do it. All right, so this is where we have to understand what that means, because that cruelty that we feel when we're confronted by the need of tzedakah, that's the cruelty that lives at the heart of the land of wealth. So let me try to explain a little bit more what Rav Shagar has in mind here. And this is from the larger teaching of Rabbi Nachman. Rabbi Nachman says, initially when a person begins donating charity, he has to break his heartlessness and turn it into compassion. So Rabbi Nachman's getting at here is sometimes we give and we feel good about giving, right? And if you're a good person, better than me, maybe that happens to you a lot of the time. Most people who come to you asking for money, most requests you get in emails, right? You respond with like a nice donation because you're a good person and that's what good people are supposed to do. But Rabbi Nachman knows, and this is true about me, and I'm guessing it's true about some of you as well, that often when we are confronted with a need for tzedakah, our first reaction is not like, oh, let me take my wallet out. Let me see how much I've got. I'm going to give you it all, right? Usually our first reaction when somebody comes to us asking for tzedakah, and the real example of this is when we encounter somebody on the streets, or you encounter somebody coming into a shul and begging for money, right? When you have that experience, when someone sticks out their hand, the panhandler, and says, give me money, or somebody shows up in shul and is like sticking the pushka in your face saying they need money, like, how does that make you feel usually? It doesn't usually make me feel generous and compassionate. Usually the first feeling I have is a bit of a cruel one. Like, who do you think you are? Like, what are you doing? Like, why should I give to you? Right? Like Rabbi Nachman, is saying here, that is where the avodah of tzedakah begins. And that is where the avodah of tzedakah is, again, so counterintuitive to the land of wealth. In the land of wealth, every interaction is about getting something out of it. This kind of tzedakah, the tzedakah when you're confronted with real need, right, you're not really going to get anything out of this. That's when it's hard, right? If you want to know the moments when the avodah of tzedakah is present, they are the moments, again, when you're not going to get anything out of this. And that's why you really don't want to do it, right? I used to see this all the time when I'd ask for money for the shul, right? You can almost like see the wheels in people's heads turning when you feel that visceral resistance they have to the very idea of giving you money, right? There's always like a moment before they speak. Maybe it's all in my head, but I felt this way. You ask, you give over the big ask, and then there's like this moment where all you see like in them is like, I don't want to do this. How do I tell you this in a way that's like the nicest way possible? I really don't want to do this. Sometimes they tell you in a nice way. Sometimes they don't tell you in a nice way, but there's that moment before they speak where, again, you feel that cruelty, whether you like it or not. He says, this is the essential devotion of charity. This is the avodah of tzedakah, is to feel the cruelty and to turn it into compassion. When someone naturally compassionate gives charity purely out of his compassionate instinct, it is not an act of devotion, because there are also animals that are compassionate by nature, right? You can look outside. There are animals that take care of, each other, right? Compassion is great. We should all aspire to it. But again, to do a good act out of compassion is not as impressive for Rabbi Nachman as doing a good act that starts from a place of cruelty. Rather, the essential devotion, the essential avoda, is transforming cruelty into compassion. Right, beginning the avodah of charity, of tzedakah, is very difficult and demanding. Rabbi Nachman goes on to describe here how, like, to overcome that cruelty is a radical gesture, because every fiber of your being wants to say no. Right, he says all devotions and all acts of repentance, whatever act one wants to carry out in service of God, must be preceded by cries of oy vavoy. Right, like he says, Rabbi Nachman is almost playing this up here, but it's powerful. Right, when you're confronted with that need where you don't want to give because you're not going to get, right? Like you feeling that cruelty, you have to like fight off that cruelty. You got to be able to say to yourself, "Oh, boy, I don't want to do this. I got to do this." Like he says here, genuflections, gesticulations, right? It's almost like a physical act that you have to engage in to overcome your own inner resistance. Again, he says, just like the Hasidim, the great Hasidic Rebbes, would do all these contortions when they were praying. Right, they'd move their bodies and would look like strange ways because they're trying to overcome their own inner resistance to come closer to God. But here we have to do that in the act of tzedakah. He says this is mainly at the beginning, for it is very difficult. Right, the hardest part of tzedakah is just taking your wallet out. Right, once you got the wallet out, it's a bit easier to like pull the money out, but it's that very first act. Right, like that's why I said it's that moment before when I would make the ask before they would speak. That's when you would like see the resistance. And again, the very beginning, the very first response is always the hardest. And he cites here from the Mechilta, Kol hatchalot kashot, all beginnings are hard. And again, there's no harder moment in the act of tzedakah than that very first moment. Can we push forward? And he actually describes it here like giving birth. Right? That's how hard real tzedakah is. A real avodah of tzedakah is like giving birth because it's painful and you don't necessarily want it. But you gotta women who, go through labor and give childbirth, it's like, profound, what they have to physically do and how they do it. And just like in childbirth, there's a transformation at the end. This is very important for Rabbi Nachman and Rav Shagar, that tzedakah that is, again, done in this way that you really don't want to give it because you're not going to get anything out of it. If you're able to overcome that, you're not the same person afterwards. There's something radical and transformative if you can overcome your inner resistance, if you can turn your cruelty into compassion. Right? I'm going to give to this person, even though I'm not going to get a penny. It's like setting my money on fire, right? Like this person disgusts me, but I'm going to give it to them anyway. This person might use it for drugs, but I'm still going to give it to them. I don't even like this shul. I think it's a bad shul, but I'm going to give it to them anyway, right? Like that's the situation of the avodah of tzedakah. It's not giving to the good in your own image. It's giving to that which you can't understand at all. And I want to personalize this for me because, as I said, I spent a lot of time in the shul dealing with questions of tzedakah. One of the powerful experiences I got to have as a rabbi is that you get to give tzedakah out. Not just I was giving tzedakah to organizations of the shul, but to people. Like you're at the front of, giving money to those in need. And it's very powerful that you have the opportunity, either personally or through the context of the shul, to like give money to people who really need it. right? You're like, you can make things happen. You can go to a wealthy person, ask for money to give to a really poor person. And there's something very, very profound and powerful about being able to do that, being able to tangibly improve people's material conditions in real ways, because you understand what's going on. You know what's going on in their lives. You know what their needs are. You have access to money potentially that you can get to them. Maybe it's a loan, maybe it's tzedakah, like whatever it is, you can make a real difference. Something very powerful and profound about that. And I learned it wasn't always easy, but I learned to always appreciate it. Mostly because these were people I knew, like on some level, right? My congregants, even people who were just connected to the shul tangentially, like I knew them, and therefore my desire to try to help them and know I could make a difference in their lives really meant something to me. But one of the things that was often the hardest for me is when people showed up at the shul looking for money who I didn't know at all. And not only did I not know them, it was very clear to me that like these were people like I was never going to know. Sometimes they weren't Jewish. Sometimes you weren't sure if they were Jewish. These were people on the peripheral of all the, of any community who are basically knocking on the doors of synagogues, hoping somebody would like give them some money. And in the early years at the shul, when people who I didn't know at all would come, and I wasn't really sure like what the deal was, right? Is this like a scam? Does this person really need it? Like, I don't know. And what I would often do is just like turn them away. I'd basically say, you know what? There's communal tzedakah organizations. You need to go talk to them. Now, I'd like to think that I did that at the time in part because I wasn't sure. Maybe it's not good to give them money. Maybe I'm reinforcing a drug habit. Who knows? But I know deep down a large part of it was because like I didn't know who these people were, and if I was going to give to them, like I wasn't going to get anything out of this. Like, who are they? Like, why am I doing this? Like, this isn't my problem. All right. I came to realize that was what was really going on, and in those moments where they would come and confront me with their need, I felt that cruelty that Rabbi Nachman describes here. I felt it very tangibly. Like I didn't want to give them money. I thought this was like a bad idea. This was not the right thing to do. I didn't want to have to do it. I wasn't going to get anything out of the shul. Wasn't going to get anything out of it. What was going on here? Right? They're going to become a leech on the shul. Like these were the things that I was thinking. Because again, like if you give and it's not right, we all assume, right? Money's a limited resource. Money is power. Like, what am I going to do if I'm giving it away needlessly? Right? That's always the fear. That's always the anxiety. And it took me a long time to get to a place where I could like have these people come and just give to them something, right? For me, that was like my avoda of tzedakah, of how do I reach a point where I can give to these people, even though like, at least initially, every fiber of my being was saying like, I shouldn't do this. I don't want to do this. I'm not going to get anything out of this. Shul's not going to get anything out of this. Maybe something bad's going to happen out of this. All right. Like the avodah of tzedakah was recognizing that like, I still got to give. Right? Because that's what tzedakah is. Like it is that absolute obligation that we have towards the other. And that kind of absolute obligation that we have towards the other cuts against the way that the land of wealth operates. Because again, the land of wealth, it's always about competition. It's always about exchange. It's always about what am I going to get out of this? And the moment that we have a relationship that doesn't fall into that paradigm, like we don't know what to do with it. And for the most part, we want to push it away. But the powerful thing that Rav Shagar understands is that ethics always cuts against whatever the status quo ultimately is, right? The status quo in any society, any synagogue is always to a certain extent one of social hierarchy and ranking and the powerful and the less powerful. It's just the way the world works. And real tzedakah, like Rabbi Nachman is talking about here, is always a challenge to that. Because again, when you're in the land of wealth, you give because you get. And real tzedakah, like that real ethical obligation that we have to the other that is absolute, means that we may not get anything out of it. But you know what? You got to give all the same. And what's very powerful for Rav Shagar is that he really emphasizes and understands that that's like something transformative, right? That there's something transformative that happens to the individual when they are able to reach that point, right? Marx, if we go back to Marx for a moment, right? When Marx sees societal oppression, for Marx, the response is revolution. There's a collective response, right? We have to seize the means of production and basically, build our, workers' utopia that we can. Rabbi Nachman agrees with Marx. I mean, that story about the land of wealth, that could have appeared in, every line in that story, I can reference you to where it appears in Capital, Das Kapital. Das Kapital is written 50 years later. But again, it's a very accurate portrayal of the challenge of modern life and capitalism and the pursuit of money that we're all consumed by. So I mean, again, Rabbi Nachman gets it. Rabbi Nachman also understands that sometimes the truly radical act is not always revolution in the broad sense, that the individual has a role to play in the radical act as well. Not just striving to be a good person and more empathetic and try to be more generous or charitable, but to actually like go at the very weak point of the whole structure itself. And the very weak point, that which enables the whole structure to operate, is this sense that like money is what matters, money is power. What am I going to get out of this? What is this worth it to me? Right. And to give tzedakah in the way that Rabbi Nachman is describing it, the way that Rav Shagar thinks is so essential, it comes back to this teaching multiple times, right? Like that's what ultimately challenges the system and enables us to, in some level, step out of it. Maybe not permanently, but it enables us to step out of it in a sense, at least for a moment, that helps us recognize what our relationships to others are supposed to be like. And perhaps in the midst of that, he says it's like a birth, right? It's transformational, right? When you come back into the system, you cannot look at it the same way again, right? And I know I've experienced that in my own life with tzedakah. Tzedakah is so complicated and so personal. But again, like that's what makes it so real. And because it's so hard, that shows us how radical it ultimately can be, especially when it comes to our obligations towards others, and especially when it comes to sort of the system that we all fall in, that often corrupts us in ways that we rarely fully grapple with to the extent that we should. So I'll end with that. I always have a minute or two. I'm happy if anybody has any questions. Please, Sherry.
Rabbi, great lecture, but you started at the beginning to talk about it in addition to tzedakah, social justice, and trying to ameliorate the social injustices and inequality. And you're very right in hinting at here in the United States, it's very political. Is it different in Israel? I mean, are people, in addition to giving tzedakah, are they more engaged with efforts to eradicate social inequality?
So it's a very good question, and I would say historically, yes. Historically, it was considered a mainstream issue. It has become more politicized in recent decades. Rav Shagar, in one of the essays which I cited from, it's an essay in which he is writing in favor of religious Zionism participating in social justice efforts, because he sees that as being again an essential part of the Jewish ethos, of the Torah's of what the Torah is all about. So what I appreciate here is that you'll find people, very, very serious religious people, who are able to use religious language and thinking to address these concerns in a serious way. That doesn't mean it's not political, but part of the challenge of American Jewish life is that it is often political in a very shallow sense. Not shallow in that it's unimportant, but shallow in that the discourse about it lacks the depth that sometimes religious thinking can offer. And that's part of what drew me to Rav Shagar even years ago, was like, here's somebody willing to explore these issues with deep theological religious language. And I had, and I was looking for that because they've deeply resonated with me and my own concerns and critiques, right? I went to becoming a shul rabbi, not thinking like shuls are somewhat insulated from like the market, right? Shuls don't have to operate like businesses. And one of the lessons I learned as a shul rabbi, and I'm not saying this as like a deep criticism of shuls, is that in the modern world under capitalism, everything is a business, right? Shuls maybe even more so than most. And that was kind of like, what made me very sensitive to these dynamics, meaning there's no place that is insulated from these dynamics, right? The land of wealth could be a shul, or the land of wealth can be Fifth Avenue, right? Like it's not like it's only in like one place or the other, right? It can and often is everywhere. And that's why I find Rav Shagar and Rabbi Nachman's point so compelling here, is that it's trying to make us sensitive to these dynamics, right? Money is not the root of all evil, according to Rabbi Nachman. But the passionate desire for money as the most important thing may very well be. Any other comments or questions?
I think also, even in the effort that doing tzedek and mishpat and imitatio Dei, that also can become a banner in terms of that I think that's what the Bava Basra Gemara is getting at, in that even if there's an interior, ulterior motive, to be compassionate, to be loved by God, to be close to God, even dveikut, and doing it purely for compassion and transformation can in and of itself have a currency, and that's very hard, to get beyond even that currency. I want to be loved by God, or I want to be like God, or and to without any ulterior motive is hard.
So the people who wave that as a banner also often think that there's never a moment in which they experience that cruelty of tzedakah, right? Like that's the thing. Like they imagine a world in which they are always ready to give, and there's always the right recipient just waiting there. So one of the things you also learn, I learned as a shul rabbi, and I say this all the time because I know people understand it. There's no ideal recipient of tzedakah. There is never a person who shows up and is the platonic ideal of what you want a poor person to be. When you are faced with real tzedakah, you are always facing an other who is different, who is strange. You're not sure. Maybe they're the cause of it. Maybe what they think is important are not the things you think are important. Right? There's no ideal tzedakah candidate who's like, oh, the good person who's just down on their luck a little bit. We'll just help them out, and then they'll be back on their feet. Everything will be great. That's not the way it works. Right? People who need tzedakah are often in very complicated, messy situations. And we often will find ourselves in those situations as well. And I think people who make, a banner out of, spirituality and morality in a way that's, again, look at me, because that's what the banner represents. Like it's about social recognition from other people. They don't recognize that we are confronted all the time by others who we really don't want to give to. There's a Gemara in Bava Batra, Mishnah Gemara, where it basically says that people who live in a small neighborhood together of buildings, like a courtyard of buildings, that they are allowed to build a gatehouse that essentially keeps the poor away. Now, the Gemara is like, oh, Mishnah says this, and the Gemara is like, well, is aware this is kind of problematic, right? They even go so far as to say that there was a rabbi who lived in this courtyard, and before they built the gatehouse, Eliyahu, the prophet Eliyahu, used to come visit that rabbi every day, right? And the moment they built the gatehouse, Eliyahu stops coming. Right now, you can read that story, and some social justice types do, as a profound indictment again of building walls, gated communities, rich want to separate themselves. You see some of that even the Rabbi Nachman story, right? But here's the thing: Chazal allow you to build the gatehouse because Chazal understand that on a certain level, right, we don't function as human beings unless there's an inside and an outside, and that means there are always people that are sometimes outside my moral concern. I will always be confronted by people who it's like, I don't want to give to them, right? That's why I'm putting the wall up. The gatehouse is there to keep them away from me. And people who, again, make a banner of, social justice, morality, just I love everybody, including everybody. They've got a gatehouse too, right? They're keeping all sorts of people out who they don't really want to give to. They just are pretending as if that's not the, not the case, right? It means giving to the other who we really don't want to give to. We may think is immoral or even evil. Like, again, there's no halacha that says that a Russia is exempt from tzedakah, that if a bad person is bad, you don't have to give them tzedakah. We'd love to think that's the case, right? There is a halacha that says if a person is deceiving you, you might not have to give them tzedakah if you're concerned they're deceiving you. But the fact that somebody is a wicked person or doesn't vote for the same political party as you does not exempt you from having to give them tzedakah, right? And that is what makes tzedakah so radical and so challenging, which that's why it's banned in the land of wealth. And that's why it's totally the countercultural act in that kind of environment. All right.
Okay. Thank you so much, Rabbi Trubov, and thank you everyone who joined us today. Just a reminder that we have the Rappaport Family Memorial Lecture scheduled for this Sunday, March 19th. It's at noon Eastern time. So the topic will be related to the Passover Seder. So you can sign up on drisha.org. Thank you again, Rabbi Trubov, and I will see you guys next time. Lehitraot.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you.